Okay, there we go. So, welcome back everyone to the first discussion for a long time. Today we're going to be covering writing theory and how to sort of actually write stories. We've done a lot of discussions about world building, character building, nation building, and the contents of writing, but we haven't actually gone over how to sort of write effectively. And so we're going to be looking at stuff today like planning and structure, objectives, mood and message of a written piece, and then a good kind of guide on how to actually write everything from the very kind of brainstorming stage all the way up to sort of conclusions and revision stage. We're going to cover a load of stuff in between. So we will start with kind of the overarching thing, which is going to be sort of planning and structure of a story. And we're going to be not looking at this from the sort of like nitty-gritty super-duper details, but the kind of overall, hey, this is how you want to do a piece. You know, you yourself want to write a story. Doesn't even have to be in Ancerious, it could be in general. How do you do that? That's what kind of we're going to be covering. So, planning and structure. So the first bit is obviously understanding the foundation of a story. You need a backbone for your narrative. Like, what is your story? Boiled down to probably only a few words, like, or just a concept. Like, okay, I just watched a movie about big stompy robots. I want to write a story about big stompy robots. Or I want to have a story segment of my character doing X. That is your foundation, okay? From that foundation, you then build your framework, okay? And your framework is what's going to happen in that story. What are the major points that you're going to be doing? What ideas are you going to introduce? What pieces are you going to be slotting into that framework that will build the overall story and allow your readers to go from one point to another, okay? This is a really important stage because this is where you decide whether your kind of ideas are going to be a bit disjointed because you're trying to shove too much in, or you're shoving in stuff that's maybe not related, or this is also the bit where you usually go like, I guess this isn't going to work, because this is where you work out what is going to happen, and then from what's going to happen, you can start piecing the points together, yeah? Because at the end of the day, it's all very cool if you want to write a story about big stompy robots, but there's going to have to be a little bit more to it than that. And if your story beats, or your greater story, or your setting, or whatever, doesn't support the idea that you're going for, or the context isn't there, well, then it's going to be a little bit hard to build a framework around it, because you're going to have to build even more framework and even more foundations. And before you know it, you're changing something pretty inherent to the situation. And you're trying to go too far in justification. So
you don't want to have it so that you have to keep fixing your story as you go. You want to make sure that you have a robust basis for whatever plot that you write that supports a stable story that doesn't have plot holes, that isn't falling apart.
And I will add something to that.
Sure.
I think that another thing that you need to know before you get to writing is, what am I actually writing about? Underneath the aesthetics of a big stompy robot, or like a panopticon people with strings, or the Russian mafia, or whatever. Like, what is my story deep down saying? Because it has to have a theme overall. Like, they kind of like the story of stories, the most like basic plot of Star Wars. The originals were like George Lucas deciding to have like this, okay, I'm going to tell the basic hero's journey through a combination of World War II and pulp science fiction with some fantasy elements thrown in. Good. Then you have the prequels, where George Lucas said to himself, okay, I'm going to tell a story about the downfall of democracy through this universe that I have already established. And as a side thing, I am also going to tell the backstory of Darth Vader. Then for the sequels, they told themselves, we have no idea what we're doing. And they just went ahead with it.
They didn't have direction or a message for those sequels. And when you're going into writing, fundamentally, writing is communicating ideas, emotions, concepts, exploring things that are relevant to reality through words. If you don't have a concrete message of what you actually want a story to be, it will just be slop.
Yeah, don't like a message. I mean, a mistake that I've seen a lot of like newbie writers do, including myself, is just like seeing writing as just turning on The Sims. Okay, you have these really established characters. You know their personalities. You know what they fear and what they like and what they want, and you just throw them together, and then you just have them interact, but with no end goal. It's just stuff that happens.
For sure.
That's one of the other points that we had here that you actually suggested, Vic, which is make sure when you're going into a story, you first determine, is this going to be a standalone piece or is this slotting into some larger plot? And in that instance, you need to figure out what an end point is going to look like. Is it going to resolve completely? Are there going to still be some loose ends that can become stories later? What are you actually doing at the end of this story? And I'll let you guys talk a bit more on that.
Yeah,
for a
and this
second.
kind of ties into the whole thing of like the next little point, which is going to be like the whole purpose of story planning. Like, it's all well and good to write because you like writing, but unlike art that can be really like easily subjective of like, I want to draw X today, and you can just do it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Writing, you can technically do that. The problem is that it's much harder to do because if you're just, as Vic and Anno put it, like if you're just kind of writing for writing's sake with no proper story framework, actual message that you're going for, and purpose and endpoint, you're just like weirdly monologuing. Like there's no purpose. There's no
It
message
reads
you're trying to
in a
convey.
very meandering way.
Yeah, and it's
It's the
kind of get
distinction
that.
between fan fiction and story. It's the difference between writing something just because you think it'd be cool and you're daydreaming about it to actually writing a story that people want to read that communicates something that people will get something out of.
Precisely, and I think that there's a few books that I've read that are kind of like this, where you can tell that the writer kind of got to a stage in the story where he wasn't 100% where the direction was going to go, or if he knew that that was the case, he didn't entirely know how to get there. And you see the sort of story start to meander in sort of wide arcs that don't really go anywhere, and the kind of ending is just this sort of weird kind of higgledy-piggledy, like what the hell is going on, and then suddenly we're back into the story again, and it gets really jarring for readers to do this. And I think that, and this is gonna be a hot take, but I know a lot of writers, and including myself, do this by writing exposition. Now, exposition is very, very useful, especially to readers who don't necessarily know prior context, okay? But when you have a big universe like Ancerious or Star Wars or Warhammer or whatever, there's a lot of lore. There's a shit lot of lore. And it could be very easy to get into what I call the lore trap, which is you're writing a story about characters, yeah, and they're doing stuff, and they're clearly on path to this particular objective in the story, and it's going to be this entire story beat. But then, like, suddenly you go off on a 2-page tangent about, like, how this world came to be as it was, and then contains, like, a load of random lore that isn't actually entirely relevant.
Yeah.
Or if it is relevant, it's tangentially relevant, and therefore it's not necessarily needed. Now, I know a lot of people who are readers who like that. They actually really enjoy stuff like that, where it's basically like, hey, mid kind of bit, here's a little side thing with like really in-depth lore. People enjoy that. Other people don't enjoy that. So it's up to you whether you want to avoid things like that or if you want to keep stuff like that. I personally like stuff like that, and I do it myself, but I do know that there are readers and people in the group who don't like reading that, and that's entirely fine, because it can feel a bit disjointed, and it can feel like the scene goes from very straightforward, I'm trying to get this particular point across, to oh, suddenly we're meandering about some random political event that happened 30 years ago in plot and is kind of related. Oh, and we're back on the plot again, and it's kind of a bit jarring. So you've got to sort of ensure that you're always on the right track, and if you are going to go on these kind of little side tangents, do try to keep it related. It should always be like, if it's majorly related to the plot, okay, this random thing that happened 30 years ago isn't actually random, it's directly related to the plot, go for it. But if it's like, okay, it's like the character makes a offhand comment about the thing, and then there's a massive tangent about it, yeah, it's a bit kind of ham-fisted and shouldn't really be in there. So always know the message that you're going for. Always know the general story beats in terms of planning. Where does your character start, or where does your story start? Okay. What are several distinct steps that they're going to sort of go through, or the story is going to go through, and what's the wrap-up end point? And what's the story that you're going to tell in part of that? I know that some people use a 5-step structure. So you've got beginning, then you've got initial, then you've got middle, then you've got latter, then you've got end point. Okay? And people basically come up with 5 different things that will happen in their story. And those are kind of like the overview. And you can shove more stuff in there, obviously, but that's the kind of like super duper duper basic framework for putting together a story. That
At the end of the day, tools like that are useful for following what is ultimately the name of the game, which is cohesion. You want to make sure your story is cohesive, and any exposition you throw in needs to feel natural within the context of the story. If you have characters talking about it, it needs to be immediately relevant. It needs to make sense that they would bring it up. Because if they just suddenly start talking about it, it's a little bit jarring. It'll pull you out of the story. You're less focused, and you're like, why are they talking about this? Aren't they actually about to go into a life or death situation? That kind of thing.
My easy
Or
money,
even worse.
my like really easy way of dealing with this is to like dedicate the amount of exposition directly to how much something is going to show up or be important to the story. Case in point with the whole Tiaze thing, the city of Abenanello, Tancremont got described pretty deeply, kind of in detail, because that's where the characters are just going to be having the whole story happen. So it gets like a couple paragraphs of just describing how the city is laid out, and that it's full of cannons, and that it's got air bases and everything's numbered, etc., etc. But for example, Maiden, that also showed up in that story, doesn't get described at all, because it's not important. It's just like a passage that happens in Maiden. It gets slightly mentioned that it's kind of like a school, but I'm not gonna like start elaborating. Oh, by the way, this is a space station that's orbiting in a strange gas giant called Hemera, where there's like damsels that do this and this and that, and the lore dates back from like the Galactic Network from BME, because then I just completely break the story. Because as soon as I'm done writing this gigantic description of Maiden, the short like story section is gonna happen. Then we're back to Tancremont, and and everything that I just described is kind of like noise.
Absolutely. So the next thing, and I guess we've already kind of covered this, is that what is your objective? Like, you need to not just ask what your story is, but what is the entire like reason for this story's existence.
What's it gonna like art, you're wanting to get a reaction out of a reader. If you're writing tragedy or you're trying to draw something that's sad, obviously you want the reader to empathize or feel sad by the end of it. The thing you should ask at the beginning of almost any piece is, what are you trying to do with this story? Is it to entertain, inspire? Is it exploring a touchy topic in a safer setting? What are you trying to accomplish as a writer? What are you trying to communicate to the reader?
Yeah, and that could be like, oh, it's just a link in the story chain. That's fine. It doesn't have to particularly like evoke any particular emotions or feelings. It can always be a link in a larger chain. But then you've got the obvious stuff where, for example, when I wrote the whole piece about the Task Force Alpha in Borealia, Okay. My entire thing was these are the forces of the galaxy that know they're going to die. But they know that by sacrificing themselves, they could perhaps buy just a little bit more time for the people of the Exodus, and that by their sacrifice, the Exodus might get to the main galaxy and everyone be saved. And the whole of the awfulness of Borealia has at least a silver lining. And the whole point of that piece was to make people feel was to make people feel sad. Like, you are watching thousands upon thousands of people ride out knowing that they are going to die. There is like no way that they're going to survive this. This is a one-way trip, but they know that their sacrifice is going to be like for the greater good. And it was all to do with just making people feel sad and like, you know, feeling for these individuals riding out, you know, Charge of the Light Brigade sort of style. And, you know, you've got other pieces where you might want it to be really nice and touchy. You might want it to be very, you know, like, oh, it really makes you think kind of piece. And you want to have this kind of core emotional approach to things where you do want to make the reader feel, and you do want to just generally have an idea of the story, but the story as the reader is going to read it. Okay, it's all very well and good with you being a writer going, this is what I'm going to create, but you've got to know what it's going to be like to read it. And we'll come back later on how you can make that easier for yourself when you're doing this thing by, you know, like rereading it back and stuff. So let's just so I think that's that bit covered. The objectives sort of covered in that. So the next sort of little segment is
I will add like one last little thing.
Go on.
If you're gonna use a fictional device as a proxy for like political commentary or whatever, which is allowed. I mean, science fiction has done that since forever. Actually take a stance. Don't just like show opposing viewpoints and then just change scene. Like the story has to like eventually take a stance, say something with the story, not just say, "Oh, the migration crisis exists." It's like, okay, so who's right, and what are the arguments on both sides, and how does it get resolved? Don't just like present and then move on.
That's a bit of an interesting one. So basically, just don't be afraid to put your political stances into your writing, effectively.
Even if you disagree with them, I mean, I've written like Nazis and communists and all of that stuff, but they're all saying they're all saying what they believe openly, kind of
in character, yeah.
Yeah, and as for my like actual agenda posts, which is I usually write about like not coping or avoiding illusion, and that is and I always just kind of have the story prove that illusion and coping and just living in a comfortable reality or meta reality is not good, and it all tends to lead to that. Might be predictable, but at least I'm not like saying, okay, the Vorna exists and virtual reality exists, and then let's move on to another topic. It's like, okay, no, actually, let's think about what this means, what is the nature of suffering, and what I think is right. Because I'm not a hive mind. I cannot write from the perspective of somebody else. I'm writing
actually like confront the subject that you're writing about, because I think in the end, writing is a really good tool to like really turn over an idea and explore it through a completely different lens, perhaps a fictive lens, but
with the added bonus that you get to read the counter idea through the villain.
Yeah.
and a good villain presents the counter idea perhaps more convincingly than the idea itself, which is where writing gets fun.
That's where you have readers actually weighing what they believe, what the characters in the stories' motivations and moralities are. You want to have them thinking by the end, okay, you don't want them just immediately assuming, hey, this guy is evil, full stop. Sometimes that's fine, but a lot of the time you want to have it be a little bit more compelling than that. You want them thinking about why a villain is doing what they are doing, because it's how you explore an idea. You have to have
I will believe that you can still have a just cartoonish supervillain, but that still has like a coherent train of thought behind him.
Yeah.
Like nobody's taking Murdif's side in any story. Or Murdif is like the free villain. But Murdif is representing something that a lot of people struggle with.
And I think it's kind of important, and this ties into a couple other points actually. You know, don't be afraid to really dive into this sort of stuff. And I think that sometimes you get two extremes in sort of both role play and writing in this kind of community. You get people who don't want to touch stuff like politics or ethnic tensions or, you know, underlying messages of society. And you also get the kind of people who really, let's just say, are quite special about certain ideologies. And there's this kind of like middle ground where you get people who are like, oh, do I do it? Do I do it? And do I not? At the end of the day, science fiction is a vehicle for extremely engaging and extremely relevant day-to-day problems and philosophical questions and societal problems that we face on a daily basis. And it always has been. From like some of the first science fiction stories, they have always been political commentary or commentary regarding IRL current at the time issues that society or people were facing. And so I think when people decide to try and shy away from that in their writing, you're kind of doing sci-fi and writing in general a disservice, because it is designed to be that kind of commentary. You can't comment on, you know, cybernetic futurism without commenting on, you know, individuality or other topics like that. And I think that if you are going to get into this sort of, you know, writing business, go balls deep. Like, don't let anything stop you. Yeah, sure, your characters might be espousing, you know, like horrible, you know, like Nazi beliefs or whatever. That doesn't mean you as a writer honestly believe that. And obviously those characters are just a vehicle for a particular story plot, just as they have been in Ancerious. And they've been, you know, beat up and killed and shot and generally seen as subhuman, which is base as hell. But the whole point is that you shouldn't shy away from these really tough topics, because that's what this is here for. This is here to use those topics and really, like, you know, put them up front to people. And, you know, you get individuals who say like, oh, you know, when was Star Trek or whatever show's political? They've always been political. They've always been, inverted commas, woke, whatever the definition of woke is these days, because it changes on an hourly basis. But, you know, they've always been like that. It's always been a case of like, hey, racism bad. Hey, we should be more progressive. Hey, we should be more communal. Hey, we should all help each other, etc., etc. And I think that you should continue that. And as writers, you should always take up the torch and continue that forward. And sure, you're going to have people who, you know, won't touch that kind of thing, and they'll always try to stay away from, you know, political commentary or, you know, as Vic said, you know, taking a side, so to say, in the story. And I think their stories are going to be bland as shit for it. And personally, I'm not going to enjoy that. I think it's going to be boring, because it shows that the writer is not brave enough to tackle the situation that they've built in their own story from an in-character standpoint, or even from a writer's standpoint. But then you're going to get the other kind of people who are, You know, the kind where they're like, oh, well, this is my thinly veiled right-wing authoritarian fan fiction where, you know, this is what I believe. And it's going to come off as an absolute train wreck because it's really easy to point out when somebody is trying to really force a political agenda that they personally believe in down your throat. There's a difference when your characters are vehicles for your personal thoughts up front, and whether they are just happen to be those characters with political thoughts in the story. Yeah? There's a really big difference. And I hate to kind of go back on, well, not even go back on, but I say the other sort of side of the argument with the whole, like, you know, all woke agenda or whatnot. But I would say that a really good example of that kind of, you know, the opposite side writing of, you know, forcing this kind of like agenda and narrative through characters is some of the latest Marvel stuff. To the point where, like, it's so blatantly obvious that they basically went, okay, the story comes second. We're trying to tell people this is how you must think. This is what we believe. And it's like, well, that's all well and good, but you could do that in an organic way in the story. You know, you don't have to be like, hey, this is bad. Like, you don't need to do that to your readers. Readers are, you know, comprehensive and capable people. They will take their own beliefs from different things. And you can give that whole sort of approach to things with, okay, I personally as a writer believe this, and this character in the story is going to believe that, but they're going to be their own character, and I'm going to keep those sorts of things separate, rather than, all of a sudden, all the main character and their supporting plotline, who are the good guys, believe in the thing that I conveniently believe. And the people who don't believe in that are bad guys, who have a very subtly different opinion, but have suddenly decided to start genociding all children because they're really evil, you know. Stuff like that, it's just, it's silly. So do not be afraid to go into these, like, really dark topics and really topical current affairs, because that's the whole point of sci-fi, in my opinion, at least, writing, and a lot of writing in general. And don't be afraid to, you know, really go mad with it. But at the same time, be careful in how you approach your own beliefs. And try not to, if you're telling a story which is supposed to be a vehicle for your beliefs, ham-fist it too much. Still try to write it as an organic story with its own, you know, purpose, its own framework, rather than just this is what I believe.
Yeah, I think a lot of this can hinge on the antagonist and who or what characters are the views expressed through. Because, and this is actually one of the things that I enjoy the most in writing, which is to write very compelling characters who are right, who believe the opposite that I do in real life, and they present the argument, and I actually just research the argument, and I go into like conservative Christian or whatever literature, and I don't just make them evil bigots. I make them like, yeah, I do believe in this. Yeah, this is my material interest, and I also make them like emotionally deep or funny or relatable or all that stuff. You know, it's not like there's a character that has to be like your flag carrier, and then everyone else is just like wretched Coronan subhumans. Because then people are going to notice and people are going to stop caring, because obviously this is just an agenda post.
And I think it's important that whatever character you're using to sort of tell specific beliefs, you need to make it, be that an antagonist or a protagonist, they should have a logical sort of progression path of how they got to that belief. It shouldn't be like, hey, here's Matt, he grew up in, you know, like this lovely idyllic little village, and he had everything he ever wanted, and he suddenly believes that Hitler was a great guy, and he's gonna go kill everyone now. Like, that doesn't really work. And, you know, on the opposite of like, hey, this villain, you know, was a really nasty person and whatnot, but suddenly he actually believes that communism is really good, but not the bad communism, obviously, the good communism. You know, like, just have them be people. If you're going to write characters, even if they're a vehicle for a particular subject, have them be real characters that readers can look at and go, I relate to that. I can logically see how this character went through, childhood or past traumas or past events and ended up believing as they did now. Because if I look at a character and go, what? Like, for example, if I look at Luke Skywalker in the original trilogy, he has a very, very, very distinct set of beliefs. He believed that anyone can be redeemed, okay? Anyone can be redeemed, even the most evil people like his father, okay? And he goes through horrific torments, and he gets his hand cut off, and he gets himself, almost killed because he believes that much in redemption of people, and that, evil people can be redeemed, anyone can be forgiven. And it pays off for him, okay? And he gets to say goodbye to his father one last time. And then in the next movie, surprisingly, he fucking hates everyone. And he's like, well, actually, nobody could be redeemed. No, sorry, this one betrayal. Oh, it's terrible. No, I'm just going to suck on this fat blue titty milk thing now and berate people. Like, sorry, that's not the same character.
Oh.
And it doesn't make logical sense. So, yeah. Alex, you have something to say?
Yeah, so something that Anna had asked in comms text there that is relevant at the moment. At any scale, the goal of a theme and a message is to establish some degree of relatability in the reader. Humans compare things to other things. That's how we work. We need frames of reference. Usually, the story can be the frame of reference for us to experience through that story other things. If you want to explore something on a smaller scale like personal touchy topics, what you would do is have that be represented in the story, not necessarily directly saying to the reader, hey, this is bad. Just let them see it. Write it how it would actually happen, how it would be, how it would logically make sense. Think about how it might affect the characters involved if it's a traumatic event. And the reader's mind can do the rest usually, assuming they're actually paying attention. Because fundamentally, we empathize with things, we compare things to other things.
Yeah, you can even have a story where none of the characters agree with you politically or ideologically or in your issue, and they're just discussing like different facets of your counter argument,
or even just suffering the results of something that is pretty objectively bad. That's as long as you can see a character experiencing something or saying something or doing something, there is a vehicle for you to, as a reader, get a grip on a concept, on an idea, and actually start to try to understand it, start thinking about it, because it's a lot easier for us as people to think about these ideas, these concepts, these painful things that we don't want to think about, politics, what have you, through the vehicle of something that has less consequence. That's why sci-fi is a good option for exploring things like that, because thinking about it through the lens of funny spaceman is substantially less mentally taxing than thinking about it through the lens of real life and the fact that it actually might have problematic impacts on people's day-to-day.
I think also is that this ties in again to sort of what Anna was saying about, how do you tackle stuff like familial abuse or maybe even sexual abuse or really touchy topics that, a lot of people just kind of hold their hands up and say, no, I'm not touching that. Like, that's too much. I say if you're going to tackle stuff like that, you need a reason. Why are you going to include something like that in your story? What does it bring up? Like, what does it add to your story? What does it add to the message that you're trying to convey? Okay? And if you can't immediately think of what it's going to do, don't touch it. Okay? But if you are going to touch it, and I'm not saying that you should never touch it, you need to handle it with tact, respect, and an actual keen eye to reality and how it has affected people. And that means researching. Yeah. It means talking to people who have suffered or gone through it and getting their accounts respectfully and coming across it with a sort of matter of fact, this has happened, it's awful. Okay? The moment you try to bend that at all, you start running into the risk of glorifying it. And another thing as well is that I would always go with something called the fade to black rule. I know this gets used a lot in D&D with like, hey, this is a scene I'm not comfortable with, fade to black. Now, if there is going to be a terrible situation where it's implied like, hey, said character has been abused in, this way, or you're leading up to that in a scene, always cut off before that point, okay? Because if at any point you find yourself writing one of your characters getting like some of this happen to them in detail, you haven't crossed the line, mate. You're 10 miles over it, okay? You're fucking sprinting out the other side, okay? Do not touch that in detail with a 10-foot barge pole unless you absolutely positively know what you're doing, okay? And you know for a fact that you can make it like A, purposeful within the story, and B, respectful. Because otherwise,
those kinds of things like sexual abuse and rape and whatever, I generally cannot think of a single time where it's like relevant to like describe in detail.
Exactly.
Because even stories where it does happen, like a lot, like I'm thinking of Blood Meridian right away. It does fade to black when that happens.
Yeah, and it's a case of like, why would you need to do that? And I know that some people are going to say, oh, well, shock value, and it's like, well, no, that's not how that works. Shock value is like oh shit, like I didn't expect that was going to happen. Yeah, not what the fuck am I reading? Like, why am I reading this? So
I think a good like example of that being done here in Ankh is the Army of the Decepticon and all the journals relating to that. Never
it's usually in the
like
past
the heinous
tense.
things that happen. Yeah, its language is used in a way that shows the effect that this kind of like existence has on these people. They're depraved. They have strange senses of value. They are inhuman, but there's almost no reason in story to go like super in detail.
Yeah, we're not gonna dedicate a scene to that. Like, it doesn't. Yeah. We don't need to go there. You can go there, but by God, you're gonna have to like have a really, really good reason to.
You gotta be,
or else it will just come off as this like gratuitous, disgusting pornography that I'm not gonna read.
Yeah.
Another thing to add on to like top of like the whole like gratuitous thing is you gotta have a little bit of humanity when you're writing characters. I know sometimes it's easy to get into a loop of like, oh, this one character has a ton of unfortunate stuff happen to them. But like, if a character is just getting beat down always, and like maybe there's suggestions of their being changed, but it doesn't happen, they just keep on getting beat down.
That is awful.
Like, there are a few times when we have noticed that, oh, this character just constantly gets bad shit happen to them. Let's change direction, and it's always fresh and cool and new to see them succeed, and it makes for a good story, I think. Like, this isn't to discourage people from writing characters in unfortunate scenarios or characters just do get beat down. It's just you have to consider the reader's perspective, and do they want to keep reading and hearing about a character that just is this like infinite source of woe?
Yeah, like if a character goes through a lot of torment, it is like, please just either have them die or have them have an arc where they get out of their situation. But if it just stays in the same place, and it gets this like repetition to it, it becomes really morbid and really disgusting.
All right. So, with that covered, right, mood and message, which I guess we've kind of already
we do march through most of that. Okay. We touched briefly on tenses and vocabulary.
Yeah,
tenses and vocabulary is where we should probably pick up next year.
Yeah.
So,
now we're getting to the real thing.
Or maybe components, but I mean, we touched on that a good amount too.
Yeah. So, one of the most important things that you can do in your writing is choose a tense. Okay, is this going to be a first-person story, or is this going to be a sort of like third-person story, or is this going to be a story where it's like, hey, everything has happened in the past, or is everything happening? You've got to choose with this, because the one thing that I notice in Ankh writing, okay, for this server, and I do it sometimes as well because I struggle, I guess, due to some kind of dyslexia, I don't know, but maybe I'm just an idiot, is when you start swapping tenses in writing, it completely destroys the story, okay? And this kind of comes from an RP perspective as well, where somebody is using like third person, like, hey, yeah, like X thing happened, and it's all in the past sort of thing. We're telling a story, and then the other person is like, X person walks up to Pulprit and like does this, and then says that and the other, and it's like, okay, well, that doesn't really flow with what I've written, but okay, thank you very much. Vic, we can hear you typing.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna mute my. I'm making a.
Okay. We never found out what he's working on. So always stick to a specific tense, yeah, and make sure that any words that you use are also in the correct tense, whether that be verbs or, whatever. Verbs is the most important, because sometimes, and again, I suffer from this especially, I'll be writing in a, this has already happened, but I'll write a verb as a it's happening right now tense, and it can completely throw everything off. Always ensure that your tenses are in place. And again, Anna will cover this later when he starts going over sort of like, how to compile all the writing and then go over and check. But it's something to really check over when you go back, because you will be surprised how much you can pick up on getting tenses wrong. And the second sort of little bit to this is your vocabulary. Okay? Now, we all have our favourite words. All of us. And we will use those words a lot. And we all kind of come up with these kind of descriptive words or verbs or whatever that we're like, oh, I really like the sound of that. And they come up maybe a little bit too much. And so you can read several paragraphs and the same word will come up so many different times, especially when you've got a series of scenes describing more or less the same action. Like, the character fires the gun, okay? You can only write they fire the gun so many different times, okay? But if you're using it in the same way every single time, it gets really repetitive and could detract from the writing quality, effectively. It really feels like they're struggling to write that piece. I recommend using thesauruses and synonym aids, which effectively go, okay, cool, you could use X word instead of whatever, or like you could use all these different words instead of whatever, and then that helps you really kind of populate a scene with different, I guess, adjectives or words that are sort of describing what you're doing, yeah, without endless repetition kind of ruining something. If you're saying that your character would do something or like whatnot all the time, it's like, it doesn't really work, or like, oh well, my character, the character might do that, like, oh, but they might do that or possibly not or whatnot. I know that I use of course a lot in my writing, or while, so I'm trying to do things to sort of like break myself out of that, but yeah, you gotta avoid those things, otherwise the writing definitely suffers for it.
To briefly comment on that, like I guess you can compare reading something or writing something to cuisine. If it feels like you're being served the same thing over and over and over, it doesn't matter how like good it was the first like couple times. it gets tiring. You need to shake up sentence structure. You need to shake up how you write things occasionally, so that everything just feels fresh. This is where your own personal reading is going to be a very big advantage. Like reading different books of different genres, different material, you're going to pick up on an increasing toolbox of kind of like writing structures and styles that you can draw upon at your own very own convenience.
I have something to add, which is kind of the counter of this, like the other extreme, which is another mistake that I see a lot in writing, which is you have to maintain a consistent point of view. You choose a tense, then you choose the voice of the narration has to be told from like one point of view throughout the whole thing. It cannot change in the middle of a paragraph, because then it gets confusing and it gives me diarrhea. I have the thing that I was typing was actually I was writing bad on purpose. So I'm making this mistake. So for example, I've got Ancerious Amy 85. The land screen flew through the Killian Verge, linking up with passing ships to update each other's databases with the latest happenings and up-to-date star charts. Reggie was just done finishing her captain's log and enjoyed her last drink before commencing her official duties. She knew it was going to be a long day ahead, contacting all the diplomats of the Krish Pact. But before her thoughts could wander off to these meetings to come, Tivata rang the doorbell of her office. She was troubled. With a huge war going on in her homeland and the build-up to the CIM offensive against Yagnar, she couldn't help but feel that for now, it was her beloved captain that was being the biggest obstacle for her duties. Here, I've actually changed point of view 3 times. I start with a neutral, objective, universal view, saying that okay, the land screen is flying through the Killian Verge and linking up with whatever. Then I go to Reggie's feelings. Then I go to Silvada's feelings without actually going through. I feel like I'm teleporting between brains and feeling different feelings that different characters are exhibiting. So either it should be told in the neutral voice, the land screen flew through the whatever, and her captain, Reggie Leaf, finished her captain's log and was ready to do a bunch of diplomatic stuff. Then she was with Silvada. Or I pick up Reggie's point of view and I say how her day went as the land screen did all that, and when she eventually met Silvada. Or I could start off with Silvada, but I cannot just mash all 3 together, because the narrative voice is jumping between characters, and you should never do that. If the narrative voice is mentioning thoughts that a character is having, you should not then mention something either objective or another subjective thought or information that this character that you're narrating through should not know. Because then the story kind of breaks apart and you're not sure who is telling it, or you're not sure where is it coming from. If I'm going to have Reggie, the conflict here is that, okay, Reggie's about to meet a bunch of diplomats, and Silvada just wants to go fighting against Yagnar. If I'm going to tell that, I'm going to have to choose one of the 2 characters. Reggie. She does her stuff, and then Silvada comes along. And then Reggie notices that Silvada is kind of uneasy. She's hesitating. She's more pushy about getting reassigned than usual. Or I do the opposite and I tell it through Silvada. But I don't jump back and forth between the 2 characters, because these 2 characters have very different states of mind. And if I mash them together in the narration, it is going to like read kind of incoherent.
I think that covers that nicely. Okay. So, next bit. Length. Now, I can't tell you how long your story should be, okay? But I will tell you that there is something in the realm of too much, and there's something in the realm of too little. And it should be done in a way that is going to get the reader and the characters from A to B in a scene that you have planned in just enough time, okay? And this kind of, I guess, mixes into what we were talking about earlier with the, like, hey, lore exposition tangents and, like, different stuff. Always try to keep your story as concise as possible, yeah? Think of it as you're a reader, and the story is a path across a park. Now, if there's just a straight, nice, tarmacked path from that side of the park to your side of the park, you could just walk straight through the middle, and you could enjoy whatever is in the park and have no problems. But if the path is like horrifically overgrown, and the park is horrifically overgrown, and the path kind of goes off in one direction, but then it also goes in another, and there's like paths all the rest of it, you're gonna find it really goddamn hard to get across that park and like through it easily. And it's kind of the same with writing, in that you want to be able to be like, okay, the character is going into a scene where they're going to be negotiating with one of the big other characters who's not a bad guy, but he's not a good guy either, and they got to try and get him on side, alright? And I go into that scene expecting dialogue, okay? And obviously a dialogue back and forth, convincing arguments, blah, 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 resolution. But if I go into that scene and it starts with the characters turning up to the place where the talk is happening, and then going through the building and them describing the building and talking about the building, and then they go into the room and then they describe the room, and then they sit down, they start talking, but then they start describing like the desk and the pens and like everything around them, we're going to be here for a fucking while, and it doesn't cut to the actual chase. So, in my experience, I personally like to jump right into the meat of a scene. I don't like to beat it around the bush, okay? A good example of this is my capital dictator person just found out that effectively the nation that he runs doesn't really exist anymore and is all just gone up in civil war, okay? Rather than the person entering the room that he's in and describing his state of mind or whatever that he's doing, and then the person interrupting him and then giving him the news, and then him going crazy and calling all of his general staff, and then them having to discuss it out, I basically just get to the point where, cool, you're in the scene, he flips the table, he's fucking pissed, and he starts screaming at people. Just straight in there. Like, you are in the scene, he is having a meltdown, he is screaming at people, he is demanding to know what's going on, and his general staff are like trying to calm him down and like do all the sort of stuff, and he's fucking screaming at them and telling them to go kill themselves and like whatever. That immediately has not only got directly into the scene to stop it from being too long and too sort of wishy-washy in terms of descriptions and unneeded length, but it's also instantly set the mood of the scene. Okay? And you can use this kind of like intro for your scenes to not only set the mood, but also keep it nice and short and concise. And at the same time, you don't want to have a really important moment being like two characters turn up, have a conversation, and it's like a bit of a conversation, and that's it, yeah? If it's an important moment, there should be some real stakes on the line. Going back to the sort of thing of like, you know, your characters have got to convince this really powerful person to side with them and not the villain. They need to make compelling arguments. Therefore, your scene needs to contain your characters bringing to the table all that they have come to believe and know to the other character. and the other character going, okay, well, here's what I believe and know, and here's what the other people are telling me. How does that all conflate? And then a back and forth, okay? And it needs to make logical sense that a conclusion, be that the character, sides against our protagonists or sides with them, needs to have a logical way of how they got there, alright? And yeah, that dialogue could go on for a while, but it doesn't need loads and loads and loads of exposition and lots of extra little bits and nitty-gritty and getting to the scene or whatnot, okay? And don't be afraid to have sort of some of it be off-screen. You could end on a particular cliffhanger where the guy's like, well, actually, the villains made me this deal, and it seems to be quite better. And then you can end the scene there, and then you go on to another scene which is unrelated but tied into the main story. And then the next scene, you can come back to these characters, and they've just come back from a recess, or, they've had to leave the room for a moment to confer with each other, and then they're like, right, well, we're coming in back and tackling this again, yeah? You don't have to have it as you are following the characters every goddamn step of their journey. Focus on what moments are important to the story and will get your message across, and work within the framework. Cut out all the rest. If you've got anything that's happening in between those scenes that the readers don't sort of witness, have the characters describe that and intro that as exposition in the next scene, but in a way that seems like, yes, it happened. It's not just written in as extra fluff, yeah? Like, oh, damn, that was actually quite like a serious thing. Yeah, we did that and that. Do you think it will work? I don't know. Like, we'll have to find out. And, don't be afraid to use off-screen happenings to aid with cutting down length, but don't do it in a way that seems that you're telling, not showing. Always show, don't tell, but show the key moments. Don't have it too long, don't have it too short, and get into the crux of the scene and use that as a mood setter.
The thing that I feel like people need to avoid is that there is something called a shooting script. A shooting script in Hollywood, or in cinema, is a script. It's a more advanced version of a script. A script only tells you actions and dialogue. A shooting script actually tells you audio, SFX, VFX, and position of camera, and the precise gestures of characters. A shooting script is made to over describe things, and it has to over describe things, because then you hand it over to a production team who have to put the cameras in such a way and prepare the lighting and whatever. However, since this is just a free-form narrative writing, you can fall into the trap of over-describing things to such a length that it reads like a shooting script. Do not. I would say generally avoid describing the sub-actions of an action. And for this, I have written two more examples, one bad and one good. The bad version of this, okay, so Sylvantha and Cora meet together. The bad version of describing this is, I'm Cora and I'm crazy. 171 Cora winked, nodding while bringing her hand up to her field cap to flip it a precise 15 degrees and tilting her head in such a way that the hanging neon lights reflected off of her classic aviator's glasses. The good version of this is just, hi, I'm Cora and I'm crazy. Cora nodded, accentuated it with a gesture. Just I don't need to know the exact things that she did. It's just Cora, and she said she's crazy, and she did something. And then maybe I can build up upon it with the reaction of the other character. But I don't need to describe every angle and every molecule of the gesture that has taken place.
To add on to that very briefly, is that the reader is capable of filling in details as you guide them. Your description will have certain directions that it takes of expectations and context that can fill in any detail gaps that would otherwise hurt the flow of the story. You have to write with these kind of this pace and direction and intentionality in mind that makes it possible to have concise writing that still feels full and rich.
Yeah.
Indeed, and I actually just noticed that that I made a mistake in both the good and the bad descriptions of my of this little scene that I had, which is the dialogue is "Hi, I'm Cora and I'm crazy," and then I immediately like repeated by Cora winked or Cora nodded. Like obviously Cora said it. I don't have to repeat it, and that is another thing that you have to avoid at all costs, which is repetition of information that you've already given your reader.
Do not assume your reader is stupid. That is insulting, and you will lose readers very, very quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like maybe after a "Hi, I'm Cora and I'm crazy," you say something about, or I say something about Cora besides her name, like the damsel winked, or the old woman winked, or she winked in a stylish manner. But don't just like repeat her name after she just said it. And in general, this tends to happen a lot. Like some information will be stated, then the character is going to like comment on that information, but in like in a very descriptive way. And I'm like, but you already told me this through the narration. I don't need to like get it again through the subjective point of view of a character. Just move on. Just like have a character have a unique take on like, oh my god, Cora is crazy or something like that. Don't have something happen twice. Never.
Burst. All right. Anno.
Yeah, hold on, I'm chewing.
Chew.
I started munching on a protein bar midway through that.
I see.
Okay. So, what I'm going to cover next is less focused on actually how to design a story, but rather how to get your ideas onto paper. Because the hardest part for a lot of us is motivation. We're easily distracted. We struggle on actually converting our ideas into the words on the page that people want to read. Hold on. Give me just 1 second.
He's chewing.
He's chewing.
That's a
Okay,
repetition.
Jesus Christ. Sorry, dogs are being insane. Okay, so the basis of this, my recommendation, I'm just going to walk through what I do because for some reason what I do has helped other people. Boomy, for example, got helped because my method works. I struggle a lot with motivation. I struggle a lot with getting distracted. My method is essentially broken down outlining. You start by coming up with a list of ideas and brainstorming. You come up with ideas for the story as a whole, for where things are going to end up, for things that might happen during the story. You write it all down, no regard at all for what actually works. Just get all your ideas on paper. Simple as. One sentence at a time. No one else is going to see that. Just write it plainly. Sometimes having the pieces on paper in front of you makes things substantially easier for you yourself to understand and to arrange. After that, the basic goal is cleaning up. Take the ideas that don't work. Take the ideas that don't make sense, that you aren't feeling, that aren't fun. Cull those out and start building an actual outline. Start writing, okay, so this is going to happen. This is the ending. Here are the logical things that will happen in between. Here are the characters that will be involved. Once you do all of that, you're going to start having enough of an idea of what's going to happen in a story to fill in the gaps. Think about it, what's a good example for this? If you know most of the variables in play, it's pretty easy to see how they're going to interact. It's pretty easy to fill in the gaps of this outline just by inference, just by logic, just by, okay, this character and this character hate each other. What are they going to do? They're going to disagree. They're going to fight each other. They're going to argue. Then from that argument, you can start throwing in other variables like, hey, this is the setting they're in. So this argument's going to be relating to this story, working towards this end goal. Really, the focus here is write things down. Don't leave them in your head, because in your head, they aren't doing any good. You're not going to get anywhere by just keeping your ideas in your head. The hardest part of writing is actually getting started, because as anyone here can probably attest, once you get writing, usually it's pretty quick to get everything on paper and have a rough draft ready to revise nice and fast. The way I do it is writing down the ideas and then expanding on those ideas, writing down components to those ideas. So if I have a scene where I want somebody arguing over a political thing, obviously you need the political thing defined, so define that, then define variables relating to that. The goal is to basically slowly break something down from a bite-sized piece and increase resolution. Keep adding more and more components to that until eventually you have a full actual outline. You won't even realize you're doing it. Don't go into it expecting, hey, I'm going to write a whole outline. Just go in saying, hey, I'm going to write down a couple ideas and expand on them a little bit. And naturally, over time, you will get to a point where you're able to have that whole story roughed out and ready to be actually converted into a story. Usually, by the end, you should have an outline capable of letting you convert sections of the outline into paragraphs, into concepts, and all that jazz.
And
then
I
after
see-
that, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Finish your point.
Then once you have everything written down on paper, once you have your rough paragraphs, essentially just keep making the outline more and more detailed until eventually it's a story ready to revise. Then go through and revise, make it clean, make it look good. Functionally, this should be able to break whatever task you're doing writing-wise into bite-sized pieces that are able to be tackled even if you're not motivated, even if you're easily distracted. The goal is make it small, make it tackleable, because we all struggle with that. And you were saying, Vic?
I said that. Who is this? Anastasia actually raised a good point, which is repetition for the sake of dramatic effect.
Yeah, that's possible.
And I would say, like, yes, you can do it, but is repetition itself dramatic? If you say 3 times that a guy got shot, that doesn't make it more impactful. However, for me at least, repetition is very useful when you want to convey monotony, like thought loops, boredom, or like negative feelings of tediousness or fatigue. I have like a whole paragraph of a thing that I posted a while ago, where Sigrun is talking about, or she's thinking about Haeckel. And it's almost nothing but repetitions. She is thinking. His voice still echoes in my mind at times, his very aphorisms masking the true essence of his words. Be like stone, be like rock, be like the mountain, be like him, close-minded, inflexible, emotionless, lifeless. And I had to play along, bowing in reverence and uttering the shibboleths of this panopticon, this psionic spectacle that they all marvel out with dumbfounded, slack-jawed expressions, each which lacks any semblance of meaning or purpose. His recklessness has liberated me, released me from the shackles of pretense, and for that I am grateful. Finally, I possess what I sought all this time, forgiveness, redemption, a tabula rasa. They feign they're doing this for the advent of their heaven. Would they behave differently if the panopticon didn't loom over them? No, they would still be the same stone-cold killers they are now. They merely possess a justification. Like, this whole thing that I read is basically nothing but, like, she said 2 things, but she repeated that 4 times each, I think. And that is because she's just like having this thought in her head, and she's thinking over and over about it. And that was by way of like conveying the fact that this like thought is not leaving her head. But if you start like repeating something that's really dynamic and exciting, then it undercuts it, I believe. So there is a place for repetition when you want to evoke the emotions that are related to repetition. You cannot just say like have this like super dramatic moment where oh my god, Sigrun just got decapitated by some others from the army of the Synopticon. Now let's rephrase this in 17 times. That just slowly erodes the impact of it. But the things that feel like you're stuck at DMV are actually enhanced by repetition. Now, don't take it too far, and don't like write 2 pages about a character waiting at DMV. But a couple repetitions here and there in those kinds of places, I do like, and I think they're useful.
I love how we were going on about tangents earlier, and
This is not a tangent. This is an topic.
anyway, as you were saying, Anno.
Well, I covered the majority of it. The TLDR, the simplest part of this is my Google shitting itself and closing my notes.
Hell yeah.
Let's fucking go. I'm so glad. I'm so glad Google doesn't function 98% of the time. The main base or brief of this is come up with the idea, your goal, your endpoint, your message, whatever. Write out your ideas, sort them into a list, and cull the ones that don't work. And then turn those ideas into outlines for different sections of the story, different events, different characters, what have you. And replace those outlines and their subcomponents with words, with paragraphs, with the story. Do it bite-sized, do it one little bit at a time. If you have the motivation, hell, knock the whole thing out. But at the end of the day, this is how I, with my struggles with focus and motivation, managed to actually overcome that and get past that hurdle of starting, get a story written out. That's all I really have to say on that. I did put a link in the chat to a more detailed description of what that is and broken down into steps. But I think we can probably move on either to the conclusion or any of the extra talking points that we had there.
Well, I was actually going to expand and say, I think that you're really quite correct when you say that you don't actually necessarily have to tackle it all at once. Like, you don't have to write everything in one go. I know it's easier, and some people find it easier because you've got the story fresh in your mind. The kind of the plot's there, you're hammering out those words, you're in the character zone, etc. But if you really struggle for motivation, don't be afraid to write stories over weeks or months. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. You're getting out the story in the end anyway. It doesn't matter if that's tomorrow or 4 months from now. Like, you're still writing, and the very act of doing constructive writing is progress, and progress is good. So I think that is actually really, a really important point that doesn't get covered enough. Is that don't rush it. You are writing also for enjoyment. Don't rush it.
Also for because a lot of people are doing collaborative writing and journal posting or whatever. Each journal should have, even though it's part of a bigger thing, it should have a defined beginning, middle, and end. Even if you are writing episodes in a larger thing, each one should just tie up at least one of the elements that was introduced. It shouldn't just be raw sewage that just keeps on going and going and going and introducing new things and just merging things together. At least some element of the episode should close in on itself and be unique. Maybe it's a location. Maybe this episode takes place in a different location that is unusual. Or maybe these two characters start talking to each other, and they by the end of it they hook up. But there's 10,000 other plot threads that are still open. But each journal should still, I think, start and close something. That way, it's its own thing. You can read a mini story within it. I don't need to read 500 journals for a thing to actually start, get going, find a difficulty, and then end. Because then it's boring. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, I know. I agree.
Yeah.
Every story should be a story. If that's a bit of a weird way to put it, but yeah, every story should be a story. No matter how
Every
small
chapter
it is.
should be a story,
Yeah,
like
every
every
segment.
episode.
And I find that that's really important, as you said, with doing collaborative journal posting, where even if, we're doing a collaborative piece where, it's the assault on Yognar, for example, and loads of different people are posting, each of those posts, even though it's just introducing their character, their forces turning up, what they've brought, etc., what their political take is on the whole situation, those should be individual little stories, little segments, Like, hey, we've turned up, we're introducing the characters, and we're going to start the assault. That's your, beginning, middle, end. And that's how it should be. And
I actually think that you should go further. That you should have like a sub story within the chapter that gets resolved in the chapter itself.
that's quite a nice one. I mean, I did that with the Union, where it's like, the whole sub thing was their that sounds like my chair breaking. It's they're turning on their like main reactors effectively. And
Yeah, so something like a process that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That gives its own feeling, its own like thing. Oh, this is the reactor thing, and then well, obviously the plot is still going on, so we move on to the next. So speaking of Ignore, for example, the another one of the like prologues was which I've been bringing up all along is Silvada finally gets permission to leave the land screen. That is kind of transitional. That is kind of a filler thing that she's not in the land screen and she's not in the front either. She's just like going from one stage to the other. So how do I make this into into its own little story? Okay, so they start talking about marriages and relationships and their past in this little story, and everything gets tied up, and they leave, and they've kind of left their mark on each other. So it's not just like taking Sivada and from this space place and then like dropping her somebody else. Something actually happened in the middle that resolved itself.
Yeah, I think that works. Okay, what else have we got? Yeah, we kind of went like so. I think one thing that we have missed is revisions and double checking your work. We've gone over like how to do the skeletons and like Anno really nicely went over like kind of like what's your framework, how to expand and do the outline, and like etc. etc. And we've kind of gone over like context and everything else, but the whole important thing is even with little things like this, it's a really good habit to get into to check your work before you like post it. Okay, and that can be anything from just doing multiple drafts and sending it to other people and being like, hey, can you give this a read and like check over and make sure that I've covered all the bases, make sure I've not horrifically buggered up the story, especially if it's a collaborative piece, and make sure that all the grammar's correct, and then you could go back and you can. I think that this is something I personally don't do. That's because I hate the sound of my own voice. But you can go back and read aloud your piece, and you will very, very quickly realize that if you go and do that, how long running on sentences can be, and how important commas and full stops are inside of like paragraphs.
Oh my god, yes, you have to.
I go back and I like literally start reading my stories to say, Kira, and I like to run on sentences. And Christ,
You're kind of you kind of like him.
Yeah, and you just gotta go back. You can then redo your sentence structure. You can identify when you're using repetitive words. You can go back and understand like, oh, actually that doesn't really sound right, or that doesn't really work. And you can restructure your whole thing and come up with a much smoother reading experience because you've read it. Writing a piece and reading a piece, even as the writer, are two very, very different experiences. And therefore, you need to go back and read it so that you can then smooth it back out for any further readers.
Yeah, I do feel like we need to like double emphasize the point about run-on sentences because they're like rampant in ink writing.
Yes.
Actually, you need to reread what you just wrote to find out when you stop talking about something and you start talking about something else, and like divide those points. Because or else it's gonna end up like this constantly like jumping monologue that changes topic 15 times, and maybe it may be like it came out naturally while you were typing, but as you read it, it's like, oh my god, I tried to like shove 15 points into the same like sentence, and I just like put commas in between 70 different things that the character is saying. And once again, I did it on purpose for in the same journal of Sigrun.
Yeah.
Where she says, she's still angry. She's still and Sigrun. One thing to emphasize is that all of these rules are there for you to break at the right moment. And I usually try to avoid run-on sentences, but I like maximize run-on sentences when Sigrun is like having monologues.
And it's supposed to show like desperation and stuff, effectively.
Yeah, she says, "I need Morrigan to stop beating around the bush this instant, or for somebody to destroy this aircraft right here and right now. We are going fast enough that the slightest nudge would shred this airplane to ribbons. No stupid wasting of time, asphyxiating or suffocating. We have enough momentum for our carcasses to keep tumbling through the air at supersonic speed for at least a dozen miles. And at this speed, hitting air is like hitting concrete. This insufferable twink will be disfigured beyond recognition. It is in a quarter of a second, and within 4 seconds, all bone fragments bigger than a penny would have been ground up by aerodynamic resistance. It will take us a good 3 days to finally reach the ground as a finely aerosolized mist, and we will spread from Kinsella to the Meshuggeian Sea. Then some poor liquidator from the Kinsella reclamation zone will breathe us in. It's extremely unhealthy to breathe in aerosolized human remains, let alone those of a damsel, and he will get a lung infection." So she changed topic like 4 times in the same line through run-on sentences.
And you struggle to read that.
Yeah, and it's really hard to read. But if you're writing this like normally, you just like put several stops or like paragraph breaks between different points that a character is making.
Do you mind if I add something in here? I might actually have something regarding revisions. So one of the options when it comes to revisions that is, I would say, useful in certain circumstances, but can be a bit of a trap, is proofreading. Specifically, having someone else, having like a study buddy, read over something. And sometimes, especially for big posts, that can be a fantastic thing. For situations where you are yourself writing something immensely long, and you need a second pair of eyes, and you have someone that you go to pretty consistently, it can really, really help you present a really strong piece of writing. But it's a bit of a trap, because there's a time and a place for a proofreader. A time, as in, you don't want to make it where if you're doing a small post, like not even like a single like Discord maximum of the characters, that is not something you should reach out and be like, hey, can you read this over pretty consistently? Because at the end of the day, you're not always going to have someone with your full attention for that. For example, if I were to write a small post and then at Pierre, be like, hey, can you read this? You have to read this before I can post it. It now makes it where I am being very inconsiderate to Pierre. Because now I'm making him take time out of his day that he may have not had to read over my thing so I can post it. You're putting pressure on him for something that you're doing. And so when it comes to like using a proofreader, having a friend of yours look over your writing, it is one of these things that you want to do. Is you want to think, is this the time and the place for this? This is a post that I think would benefit from this. Is it a sort of thing where I'm going to like really like take time out of someone's day from doing this? And is it just better for me to read over it and just post it? Because at the end of the day, if it's not going to be a big post read by a ton of people, if you're just going to be sending it off to one person and like 3 other people are going to read it in an RP, is it fully worth it to do that? To like take the time out of your hands? So proofreading is useful. Don't get that wrong. I think it's incredibly useful. I use it all the time, but make sure to be considerate of the people you are asking to proofread for you.
Anyway.
Okay. I have one more thing to add that was something that me and Latro discussed a little while back. It's mostly to do with structure, how structure and outline includes establishing a vibe for a scene itself. Hold on. But for example, we're planning a thing for an upcoming RP. Functionally, we know what we want the vibe to be. We know what the onlookers should feel, what they should see. One thing that you can do for something like that to communicate a vibe is to describe what is happening from the point of view of a third party. If you have 2 characters fighting, for example, you can have onlookers, bystanders, soldiers, witnesses, whatever, witnessing this, and they can be more of a self-insert for the reader, more or less. You can have a more literal, this is what you see, this is what you feel, as somebody experiencing this fight. Whether it's something along the lines of feeling the scorching heat from a firestorm in the sky, seeing falling debris from buildings, whatever. Ultimately, you want to have some kind of vibe. You want to have inspiration for that vibe, and that can be through media inspiration, what have you. That's more or less the only other thing that I wanted to add. She did give me some of a script, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit because my talking drive is faded as of like 20 minutes ago at this point, but I'm trying to make sure I get all the points across.
I see. Understood. All good?
Yep.
Okay, so I guess, does anyone have any questions?
Should we mention like the role of like metaphor and linguistic devices and such?
If you wish to, yeah.
Yes.
I recently got a hold of a particular creative writing textbook, which I think has quite a few really decent passages. And I wanted to take the time to read this one in particular that kind of put into perspective the role of image. And I quote, "There's a simple trick at the heart of imaginative writing. If I say, quote, not everything that appears to be valuable is actually valuable. You will understand me in a general kind of way, but you won't think that I've said anything interesting. In brackets, and you might feel a little preached at. Whereas I say, all that glistens is not gold, you literally see what I mean. The trick is that if you write in words that evoke the senses, if your language is full of things that can be seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched, you create a world that your reader can enter. It is no accident that the words image and imagination have the same root, Latin imago, a picture or portrayal, because what all imaginative writing has in common is that it calls up pictures in the mind. Any sort of writing, reports, treatises, theories, instructions, may be enlivened by example. But the kinds of writing we group under the heading imaginative, poetry, song, lyrics, play, scripts, film scripts, personal essays, memoirs, exist fundamentally as representation. They portray people, places, and objects as if physically present.
Thank you, Wikipedia.
Yeah, I've come to really like this particular textbook. I'm going to see if I can upload this.
It will be uploaded to the resources hub. I'm intending to create a writing resources section for it, as there has been a number of good resources that people have brought to my attention. And so there will be something there. So if you want to like read any like literature or any like websites that we find, that will be the place to look.
This textbook is particularly good because it has passages from kind of like other pieces of writing in it that the author received permission to include. It also has some writing exercises in there, so I recommend maybe from time to time we can put in like ask the community, for instance. We can put these writing exercises in if people choose to kind of flex their writing muscles from time to time, and they don't know how to structure it at the moment.
Works.
It could be fun.
So, does anyone have any questions? Latro is typing. Possibly not.
Who knows at this point?
People are typing, but are
I'm gonna question. And what's the question, Latro?
I think Latro is going to question.
they? Latro is going to question.
I don't know. I'm not too sure.
Is Latro really questioning?
What does it mean to question?
What is the best way to convey a sense of awe when writing something you want someone or something to feel large or powerful or intimidating? Obviously use big words. Like, you could say that something's big or huge, but you need to say stuff like Titanic or all-encompassing. You know, you need to use descriptive imagery that evokes a sense of scale in certain
I think
ways. Or in terms of, like, you need to describe the effects that it can also have on the character in terms of, like, awe. Like, why is the character feeling awe? We'll describe what it is. Why is it powerful? Like, is it a presence? Is it its size? Is it its general appearance? Like, what is it that is making them feel awe on its side of things? But also, why is the character feeling awe? You know, is it they responding to something that they maybe is triggering that awe that only that character can feel, or is it just a general thing? But I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, this guy is super imposing and he's giga OP and like X person like feels like is overwhelmed because of it. Like, you've got to really evoke why.
Yeah, for like super maximal stuff, I think one of my cheat codes is to write like the physical and meteorological effects that such a giant thing would have it. So if I am trying to like emphasize that this mech is mega super huge, I am probably gonna like from the point of view of the character or the narration, I'm gonna mention that it's so tall that it's actually causing a cloud formation around it. Or if this tank has a super gun, I'm not gonna say, oh, by the way, the rail gun shoots at max 150 and it has a depleted nightstone bullet that goes at light speed, whatever. No, I'm gonna say the tank fired and the shockwave from the gun was enough to kill somebody 20 meters away. Like spray him onto the wall without even hitting him. And that kind of conveys like the energies involved.
I think as well for characters, if you're trying to convey like a really powerful character, kind of, is just been revealed to your main character or whoever, I think also mythological comparisons can also really quite help in terms of like, oh shit, like this guy is awe-inspiring, or like, you know, you feel dread or whatever when like interacting with them, because they evoke, like, you know, they're almost like a demigod. And, you know, it's like this ancient myth where, you know, X or Y happened, and it helps just to give more illusion effectively.
Another good thing to keep in mind is that if you say things like, "Oh, this thing is big, this thing is titanic," is that, like, big and titanic is all well and good to say that, but these are kind of like abstract demarcations of value. You cannot like taste or feel
was kind of
what
my
huge is. And yeah,
that was kind of the point that I was
from what
making.
Vic said is like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that was kind of the point that I was making, where saying that something is mega super huge Titanic is just kind of a
it's abstract. Like, it's not.
But if you say that something is breaking this mech, which was so tall that its chest was breaking it into the troposphere, and it had to lean into the jet stream, that kind of conveys how fucking huge this thing is.
Yeah, and again, it becomes a set of images which showcase the scale, like a super fucking mega this particularly large mech walking over the platoon, the shade of it causing the temperature to genuinely cool down, and by the time the sun comes up again, it's they feel like a rise in temperature. It's all about immersion, I feel. Like, you cannot rely on vocabulary which says it's big.
Yeah,
no,
you have to describe the physicality of how it is big.
You need to put the reader in the place of witnessing something so huge. Like, think if you've ever seen like skyscrapers and you're looking up, you're craning your head up at it, or other like really large structures. It's a whole experience, right? And that's ultimately what you're evoking. And the same is for like degrees of power or influence. Demonstrate the effect above all, and demonstrate the sensation and experience above all.
Alright, and Scout has said, an issue I feel on a constant basis, I feel I over-describe settings to insane degrees. At the same time, I feel an instinctive need to paint the scene, especially for locations that are brand new or carry a lot of importance. I feel like I don't describe them in detail, I'm coming off short, like I'm underselling it instead. I can't seem to strike a good balance. Basically, as we kind of covered earlier, only describe what needs to be described that is relevant to the ongoing situation or the plot.
If we're gonna linger onto an area, you can keep detailing it. But if it's just like this scene takes place here, don't over describe it. Just like give me a general like view of it. Oh, there's a big building in the middle. However, if 20 chapters are gonna happen in like Alberanti, you're gonna have to like delve into like, okay, there's this hyperbolic tower that goes 40,000 kilometers high, and it has like an eclipse trap within it that has been like spiked through with strange psionic technology that are like sucking out its energy and using it to power some strange device that erases memories. And then you go into the and then if you stay there even longer, you go to like, oh, this thing is like actually filled with a fluid, and there's like little submarines diving in it, and like picking doing like medical things on the Eclipse Lord. But if you're only just like flying by this scene, you don't need to describe all of this nonsense. You just say, okay, we went to Alberanti, where there was a huge tower, and then we flew on to Elfilera.
Okay. All right.
Any more questions?
Any more questions at all? This has been a long talk. It's been good. It's been nice.
There's
We
a
haven't
lot to
done this for
say.
like half a year, so
Yeah,
I
it's
know,
good
I
to get
just
back
Make
to
it up
doing
for
things.
lost time.
Yep.
But I think that's mostly everything. I got everything that I wanted out for sure.
awesome. Okay,
No,
well,
I'm glad you did.
thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you, Anno, Vic, Pierre, and Boomy for your contributions. And we will catch you all next time for whatever that may be. So we will.
See ya, love you.
Goodbye.